Hey, good morning. This is Joe Van Cleve, and today I'm going to talk about box cameras, homemade box cameras, and what kind of lenses that you can use with those cameras. Stay tuned. One of the more popular videos on my channel has been about homemade box cameras. And people are interested in this because people are interested in figuring out how to make stuff for themselves, how to be crafty and creative. There's been some questions recently by some of my viewers about what kind of lenses can I use, can I adapt for use with a large format box camera, something like 4x5 inch format. Can I use a lens designed for a 35mm camera? Can I use that for a box camera? Will it project an image big enough for my use? Okay, so what I have laid out here on my table, I have 7 different kinds of lenses, and we're going to look and see how each one of these might work as a camera lens. So let's start in the upper right hand corner. This right here is a plastic Freneau lens. This is the kind of little plastic lens you'll buy at a bookstore that you use for magnifying the words on a book, the page of a book. It's just a little credit card size magnifying glass. This lens is a Fujinon Xerox. It is a 24 centimeter, 240 millimeter lens. It has multiple lens elements in the body, and it's a Xerox machine lens. And I mounted it to this piece of wood because I can mount it to my speed graphic. So we'll see about how that works as a lens. This lens again is the 7x30 or 7x50 binocular lens objective, and it has 2 optical elements in the lens itself. Okay, this lens, this is an enlarging lens, and this is a Kodak Ektar 78mm f4.5 enlarger lens. This is the little Fujinon TV camera lens, 35mm focal length. It has a variable aperture. It has f-stops that go from f1.7 up to f22. This is a loupe, just a plastic, cheap little magnifying loupe for looking at negatives or slides. And because it magnifies, it'll project an image. We'll see how that works. And finally, this is another enlarging lens. This is a rodent stock, 105mm, and it has a variable aperture. Okay, in order to test these lenses, and if you find lenses that you suspect will be good camera lenses, this is a good way to test them. I'm in my little shed in my backyard, so it's fairly dark in here except for the light coming in from the door. I have a piece of white board set up, and it's just clamped to my tripod. And I'm going to use this as a makeshift projection screen or view screen so I can see how much of an image will be projected by each of these lenses. I have a piece of black craft paper, and I have a hole cut in it. And I'm going to use this piece to kind of block the light coming in from the door so I can kind of darken this projection screen, and hopefully we can get a good idea of the image coming out of each one of these lenses here. So let's test these and see what happens. Okay, the first lens up for test is going to be this binocular lens. Now, these two, you're looking at this board at an angle, kind of a 45-degree angle, but there's 2 pieces of tape here, and they're about 5 inches apart approximately. So that kind of gives you a sense of a 4x5 inch image area there. So I'm going to put up my little baffle and put this lens in place, and you'll be able to see at an angle that this binocular lens easily projects an image big enough for 4x5. And you can focus the lens just by changing the distance between the lens and the projection screen. So I can focus it for different parts of the image there. So this binocular lens definitely works for 4x5. In fact, even without the baffle, you can still see it projects a pretty good size image. The little Freneau magnifying glass, plastic Freneau magnifying glass. I'm going to put it right up in front of the piece of paper here, and if you look here, that Freneau magnifying glass projects a pretty big size image. This thing would cover 4x5, maybe even 5x7. Now the image is rather soft because it's a single element meniscus Freneau lens, and it probably needs to be stopped down to a smaller size aperture to get a little bit sharper image. Also, the focal distance on this one is a little bit longer than the binocular lens. But you can see that it projects a pretty good size image here, which is pretty cool for a plastic lens. This big honkin' Xerox copy machine lens. And this thing has a fixed aperture of f4.5. And I have to pull this lens way out. This has a long focal length, 240 millimeters, so like 10 inches almost. But it definitely projects a pretty good image, really sharp image. And yeah, this would make a really good camera lens. And in fact, I have used it as a camera lens, but there's one issue with it. You can't vary the aperture. If you try putting an aperture stop over the front of the lens, it'll vignette the lens. The same thing if you try putting an aperture stop on the back. This lens design, you have to put the aperture in the middle of the optics between the lens elements, and you can't really do it because it's sealed up. So it's a fixed aperture of f4.5, so it'll work, but getting your exposure right is real tricky. Okay, the next lens is the 78mm enlarging lens. So the 78mm Kodak enlarging lens. Now, this thing is small. It has a small image, and it's not going to cover 4x5. This image size is maybe going to cover 2-inch square, or maybe 3-inch square at most. Let's try that other enlarging lens. This is 105mm with a variable aperture. And look at that. That one is nice and sharp, and that looks like that'll cover 4x5. And that's nice and sharp. So this is a possible lens for a 4x5 camera. It has a variable aperture, as I indicated, so you can adjust your exposures and your focusing depth of field. The next lens is the little TV lens. And this one is going to be hard to see from where the camera is at. I'm going to have to move the camera, but basically it projects a tiny little image. Tiny little image, smaller than a 35mm film frame. So that image it projects is too small to use for a large format. And finally, I have this loupe. It's a single element plastic lens used for viewing slides, but this one here is also very small of an image. It's only about the size of a 35mm slide, or negative is the size that it projects. So it's a little too small of an image for large format. It's only going to be able to do, like I say, something about the size of a 35mm frame. So it might have seemed like, if you review the results from these sample lenses, it might have seemed like the short focal length lenses projected a small image size, whereas the longer focal length lenses projected a much bigger image size, even including the Freneau lens magnifying glass. And so you might come to the conclusion that if I want to find a lens to cover a 4x5 box camera, all I need is a long focal length lens. Well, let's test that theory out. I have another long focal length lens. This one is a Tokina lens, mounts on a Minolta MD film camera, and it's an 80 to 200mm focal length. So at the 200mm focal length, which is like that, I should be able to have a really large image circle size. But it only projects an image big enough to cover a 35mm film frame. It doesn't project a large image. So what's going on there? How come some of these lenses with long focal lengths can project a big image circle and the other lenses with long focal lengths can't? Well, the reason has to do with, if you find any kind of a lens like this that's designed for a digital camera or a film camera that has a standard bayonet mount, it has an optical design where, regardless of the focal length of the lens, it's designed to only project an image relative to the size of the sensor. So you simply can't use a lens like this and for a large format, it doesn't project that big of an image. In the case of these system lenses like this, from the back flange to the sensor or the film is only a very short distance, whatever it is for this film format. Even though optically the sensor thinks it's looking at a 200 millimeter focal length lens, it thinks there's a lens out here 200 millimeters away projecting to that film plane. In reality, the flange focus distance is only this far. So it's not going to project a very big image because it's only this long of a flange focal distance. So you need a lens that projects a much bigger size image circle. So for instance, the binocular lens, a makeshift lens, its flange focal distance is about 150 millimeters and its infinity focus is about 150 millimeters. So that's why the film can be this far away from the lens and therefore projects a much bigger image circle. The same thing is true with the Xerox lens. It has an even longer focal length. The Rodenstock Enlarger lens was a roughly medium focal length, and it has a large enough image circle to almost cover 4x5. So the kinds of lenses you need to look for adapting to a box camera are not these kind of lenses with a flange. Remember, the flange to sensor distance determines the basic size of the image circle. If it's a really short flange to sensor distance, it's not going to project a very big size image. So one of the very first large format box cameras that I ever built with adapted lenses was this black foam core thing. And it's gone through many iterations over the years, including being decorated by my grandson in subsequent years. I originally used the mate to this binocular lens, the other binocular lens. I had actually that binocular lens mounted on the front of it. And what the lens that's on here now is a plastic Freneau lens magnifying glass. It's one that has a longer focal length than this. But let me show you how the back of this works. So it's just a box, and it's actually a box within a box. So it focuses like that, in and out. And you can see the Freneau lens. Let's see. It was a larger, I think it was one of those 8 by 10 inch size Freneau lens magnifiers that you buy at the office supply store. And I just cut it down to a smaller size, mounted it in the front of the box, and I have a cardboard holder there. And I have these little black paper diaphragm f-stops that I can put in there to stop down the lens and make it a little bit sharper. This is a 170 millimeter focal length lens, and you can stop it down to various sizes. I have a whole set of little aperture stops to control the exposure, basically by varying the f-stop. But I have a view screen for this camera, and the view screen is this structure that's made of 4 layers of foam core board, and between the 3rd and the 4th layer is where the view screen is, and the view screen is simply a piece of tracing paper. And I have a couple little holes poked in the tracing paper, here and here, so that as you focus the camera, the air in the camera doesn't try to flex and break the paper. You have to have a little room for the air to leak out. And then there's a little viewing hood. You can stick it up to your eyes, and it kind of shields you from stray light, so you don't really need a dark cloth over your head. And then I built these little crude little feet on the bottom of the camera so it'll sit down on a base on a tripod. But this focusing screen just fits into the back of the camera like that. And you can sit there and focus the image. And then when you're ready to take the picture, this is the film holder. It's also made of 4 layers of foam core board, and there is a dark slide of foam core, and you put the photo paper in here at the same position that the view screen would be relative to the front of the film holder. The back of the film holder has a little piece of tape saying don't pull it out any further than this, because it doesn't actually have a felt light trap. It's just the dark slide itself is kind of designed to make the light seal on that side of the film holder so light doesn't fog the paper. But basically, when you get the focal length of the camera set, infinity focus is up there like that, and then close focus is you pull back to focus close in. And once you get the focusing set for your subject matter, you take off the view screen, and there's a slot right in here, and here's the film holder. You put the dark slide through the slot like that and then push it flush with the back of the camera. And now the dark slide, or the film holder's in there, and now to do your exposure, you're simply going to pull out the dark slide until the arrows show, and then you will use a lens cap to control the exposure. Keeping in mind that you also can vary the aperture of the lens with the little f-stop inside the camera. So it's a very crude camera, but it really works. It's a nested or sliding box camera made strictly of foam core and gaffer's tape. Again, I originally used a binocular lens, and I have little various f-stops that I can put on the binocular lens on the back of it to vary the aperture. As you make the aperture smaller on these kinds of simple lenses, the edge of the picture gets sharper, the whole overall picture gets sharper, but because you're cutting down the amount of light in there, you're going to have to use a longer exposure time. Now, I use that purposefully to get the right exposure time, because these lenses don't have mechanical shutters, and you can't really accurately do a sub 1 second exposure time by quickly moving the lens cap on and off. Your accuracy is so poor that you'll never be able to get accurate or repeatable results. So that's why I always try to, when using lenses without shutters, I try to stop down the light enough so that my exposure time is at least 1 or 2 seconds. That way I can go 1/1000, 2/1000 or whatever, and I get a more repeatable, accurate result. So I'm oftentimes using those aperture stops to vary, not really the depth of focus as much as it is to vary the exposure, so it gets in that longer ballpark where I can get a good, accurate, repeatable results. Now here's an example of one of the f-stops, aperture stops for the binocular lens that I use. This is a piece of brass I have a piece of round brass soldered to it so that it fits rather snugly on the back of the lens like that. And with it stopped down, it's about a 3mm hole, and it's a 150mm focal length lens. So this gives an f50 aperture, so an f50. And because it's such a small aperture, it actually makes a really sharp image, good sharpness from corner to corner and pretty wide depth of focus. So this kind of turns this binocular lens into kind of a large format point and shoot camera. You don't have to worry about focus as much. What I usually do with it is I set the focus ahead of time with it wide open, and then for the principal plane of focus on the main subject matter, and then I'll stop it down, and that gives me the longer exposure time I need for my photo paper, and it also gives me much wider depth of focus. So whatever focusing errors were present there should be negligible on the camera with this way. Well, you might be wondering, how am I going to mount that kind of a box camera to a tripod? Well, let me show you what I do. You find yourself a scrap of plywood that's roughly the same size as the base of your camera, and you mount one of these 1/4-20 tripod bushings. They have various styles. There's ones with the 3 prongs, and there's this kind that uses 3 screws. But however you do it, mount it in the center there, and then this is for my Bogan tripod. You want to put the mounting plate onto the board like that, and then you can mount that onto your tripod. And let's get this camera mounted up here, this box camera, and I'm just going to set it up here. I generally use bungee cords to set up these cameras. I just bungee cord it around the piece of plywood, and it keeps it stable enough. Let's take a look inside the view screen and see what it looks like. Okay, there's the box camera mounted on my little plate on top of my tripod, and this is my view screen. So we're just going to mount it right in here. Let's take a look. Okay, this is looking through the viewing hood of the camera. I have the lens stopped down to f17, which is about a 3/8 inch hole, covering revealing just the center of the magnifying glass. And of course I can I can focus the camera by pulling the box in and out. But that gives you an idea that this thing actually does cover pretty much the entire field of view of this camera, this film format of 5x7. So a simple magnifying glass, like even the plastic Freneau lens like this one is using, will cover 5x7 if its focal length is long enough. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, there's no way that crude foam core box camera can make any kind of photographs at all. Well, here's a photograph I made. This was with the binocular lens attached to it. This is 5x7. And this is with the lens stopped down to about 3 millimeters, so it's about an f/50 aperture. This is a contact print of a paper negative. So this is a paper negative contact print. And as you can see, it's pretty sharp. So here is the paper negative itself of that binocular lens image, and it's negative number 4. And in my notes, this was 8 seconds exposure time at f/50 in cloudy daylight, I'm guessing it was. If you operate that binocular lens nearly wide open, I think I'm using like a 25 millimeter aperture in 4x5. Now look at this wonderful photo. This is taken up in Madrid, New Mexico, and it has this real soft, out of focus, swirly thing going on around the edge of the picture, because when you get these primitive lenses like binocular lenses more wide open, it doesn't really give you full sharpness along the edge. But I'm focused on this little cherub figure. This is an old Victorian era house in Madrid, and there's a cherub hanging from the eaves of the house. But because of the way the out of focus area is, it kind of looks like it's really flying, and it's kind of a three-dimensional depth to it. So these adapted optics can work really well with paper negatives for getting you some really wonderful images. And like I say, even that primitive box camera with the tracing paper viewing screen and the primitive laminated foam core film holder, this thing puts out a good image. So I hope this encourages you guys that you can do this.